Try to go from the framework or the background or the context and move toward some of the principles and practices of our work. We see the principles of a Jewish anti-Zionism that's liberatory as, first of all, being committed to human emancipation, of which the Palestinian struggle and the liberation of Palestine is necessarily an integral part. As a corollary, and speaking to exactly what Sara just said, we absolutely reject the persecution of others based on our own persecution, history of persecution, and using that as some kind of justification. We understand that an oppressed people has the absolute right to resist. Occupied people have an absolute right to exist. People facing ethnic cleansing have an absolute right to resist, as well as the right of return. Often, one of the premises of the Zionist left, one of the ways that the Zionist left has operated, has been to use the concept of peace, not as a goal, but as a strategy for accomplishing their aims. And we reject the use of the concept of peace as a strategy instead of as an ultimate goal and endpoint that is accomplished through just means. We reject anti-Semitism, whether it's in the denial of the Nazi genocide of Jews, whether it's in images of Jewish power, global power, Jews running the world, conspiracy theories, etc., etc. And as Sara spoke to, we also reject the Zionist anti-Semitism of assuming that isolation is somehow something that could make Jewish people safe.
Can you just go over that bit on peace?
Yeah. It's really central and crucial. Thank you. Sorry.
Rabab can also speak to it. No, but go ahead.
Whether it's the Zionist left political parties or whether it's the Peace Now movement, the movement in Israel for peace, if you look at their underlying guidelines, if you look at the things that drive the actions that they take, what are our guidelines, how do we understand, every one of them is premised on the logic that if we create a context in which we have peace, which I translate in many ways as peace and quiet, if we can keep suppression, if we can keep people down and quiet enough, if we can have dialogue that doesn't involve actual rectification of oppression, but is just figuring out how to get along in a context of oppression, then we will have what we want. So very concretely, at the beginning of the Second Intifada, people had had enough of oppression, had had enough of the Oslo Accords producing increasing oppression consistently. And they said enough. And Israeli Jews were so upset because their peace had been interrupted.
Their comfort.
Is that enough?
Yeah.
This is you.
Sorry. So those are some of the principles, and then we want to move to some of the practices. How do we do our work? And Lee and Sue will be speaking more concretely about that work. But one of the principles is that we assume that challenging Zionism is an integral part of the movements to also challenge colonialism, racism, and imperialism in all their forms. One of the parts of our practice is an ongoing engagement with the question of what does solidarity mean and what does joint struggle mean. And we could spend more time here, and this may be a place for useful and important discussion, as it always is. I will very shortly say that we needed to struggle with this question a lot in order to understand really how to acknowledge our own location and investment and struggling against Zionism and against the State of Israel, first and foremost because of what is happening to the Palestinian people, and also because of all of the claims against Zionism that we have as Jews that we named before. Another piece of our practice is that we don't assume we have to go to Palestine to do our work. We assume that we have to be located in the places that we live around the world as an international network, doing that work from where we live, trying to hold our own governments accountable, trying to work with the people in our own communities that have also been dislocated by Zionism and other struggles, and trying to connect those struggles locally, nationally, and internationally. We also have a very strong belief that it's very difficult for us to do our work. We would not be able to do our work if we tried to do our work alone as Jews and then to enter. That we have to be in constant conversation with the people that we're working with, firstly with Palestinians, that we cannot place ourselves as understanding that our struggle cannot be, because we have our own case against Zionism does not equate our struggle against Zionism with the Palestinian struggle. And understanding the difference between those two and the difference in the actual impact of people's real lives. This next point is similar to what I was saying about this conversation about peace. During the Oslo Accords, there were lots of dialogues, and we are not in dialogue with Palestinians right now. That is not the work we do, and if it was, they wouldn't be talking to us. That's not what works, and it's not what we need. What we need is to actually have a shared commitment to justice and to build trust between each other in order to do that work together. And every time that we work together, we're building that trust, hopefully, and that's the constant work. The last piece here is just to say that the point of our work is not so that we can be anti-Zionists. The point of our work is the point is to do anti-Zionist activism, to figure out what it means to do work from an anti-Zionist location, and to have that be the defining factor of the work, not of ourselves. We don't need to call ourselves something.
So I'm actually not going to spend time here. We do organize. We do direct action. We have campaigns. We are here with many different movements from the United States, and we figure out together work we can do together. Sometimes we do work separately but with similar goals. This work on Israel's role in worldwide repression is part of the work we're building, the campaign against the Jewish National Fund. We're also called on a lot to defend people who are attacked by Zionist organizations for standing with Palestine. And we also do work like we have this Never Again for Anyone campaign, like challenging the idea that the Nazi genocide of Jews is the only genocide that ever happened, and instead of separating ourselves from other people who have experienced persecution and genocide, including the Palestinians, figuring out how we are connected and what we are organizing against. So just in ending, a couple things. There's a lot of challenges, like in this particular role and in political work in general. Mich spoke to a lot of this. I think Kali and Rabab can as well. But, it's like you want to strategically use anti-Zionist Jewish voice and our organizing without centering Jews again in the Palestinian struggle, because so much of that struggle is getting Jews out of the center. So that's the biggest challenge, and then there's challenges of race and class and queerness and all the things we are. So we can talk more about that. I think I'll skip this, and that's we'll hear very briefly from Sue and Lee about the organizing and then get some responses. Yeah, there was a question. What? No. Okay.
So do you want to explain what we're doing now?
I just did. Lee, do you want to start?
Sure, I can start briefly by talking about how I got involved in this work. I grew up in New York. I grew up in a Jewish community that was older than Zionism and that was historically anti-Zionist. At the point when I grew up, it was a Jewish communist community. I learned some Yiddish when I was young. I didn't learn any Hebrew. It spoke to the history of Jewish organizing in New York and in the U.S. And the history of Jewish repression in other places. So that was my politicization came through that. Growing up, learning about Jewish history in relation to other struggles for liberation was very much central to it. But again, Israel was largely absent. Kind of the way they were able to have that space at that time was by not talking about Palestine. And many people in that community were certainly anti-Zionist. Others were probably Zionist, but it was silent. So I didn't have much of a context for understanding Israel until I got older, and immediately upon learning about Israel, it just made no sense to me, because I didn't grow up with the context, and so it just seemed like another example of oppression. And I very much also grew up in frameworks that said that, that just because that within any group you have the people who are resisting oppression and the people who are supporting oppression. And so when I found out that there were Jews who supported oppression, it didn't shock me. It just was like, okay, that's not what I'm about. And so I began organizing with IJAN I guess about 4 years ago in Chicago. We formed a chapter in Chicago when I was living there. Much of our work involved certainly Palestine solidarity and coming out to actions and participating in direct action, participating in BDS, but also involved protesting the annual Walk with Israel, confronting kind of Zionist organizations, and some of the, adding our name and also just kind of being a part of the broader movement in Chicago in order to kind of, one of the ideas that came up that spoke to me was this idea of leveraging your privilege to try and dismantle that very privilege. That you try to, that it is important to recognize that privilege, but also to use that privilege to highlight other voices and decenter yourself. So in terms of IJAN's work in the US, much of it is coordinated along the lines of the stuff that Sara started to point out. So the Never Again for Anyone tour brought Hayo Meyer, who was a survivor of the Nazi genocide, and had him speaking alongside Hatem Bazian, who's Palestinian, and talking about kind of the connections there and the shared histories of oppression, even as there are also historically specific differences. And we also worked to include speakers from different communities who were impacted in the US as well throughout that tour. We organized with the Campaign to Stop the Jewish National Fund, which was and continues to be is kind of an example of the way Zionist colonization is ongoing. It's both historical and ongoing, and so you see it through that organization. And so we work on that campaign. Some of our other work is in trying to challenge the ability of Israel to speak for Jews by saying that Judaism and Zionism are completely separate things, that Zionism is a political colonial project. And so through putting out discourse materials and through putting on presentations and just expanding on that, yeah, I guess I'll leave it there. The U.S. Social Forum. So also kind of within this idea of joint struggle, needing to do this work with others to avoid the pitfalls of being overly self-referential, we have participated in the U.S. Social Forum to be part of that building. Yeah, and I'll leave it there. Oh.
We still have the right to... okay. No, it's okay.
So I'm Sue Goldstein, and I'm a member of IGEN Canada. I'm also part of the Joint Struggle delegation, and I'm located in Toronto. So there aren't many of us in Canada yet. But how I came to anti-Zionism? Well, I'm going to go back a little before that. I was born and raised in New York. I was born in the city, and my grandparents were part of white flight, which is when white people moved out of inner cities because black folks were moving in. So my experience of racism in the Jewish communities, and I pluralize that on purpose because we're not a people, we're peoples who happen to be Jewish, and I'll get to that in a little bit, but was to learn about the racism towards black people in my Ashkenazi Jewish family, Crown Heights, and just that kind of thing, and coming from the white flight and growing up on Long Island, which is a very racially divided suburbs. They might be the most racially divided suburbs in the United States. My mother was originally from Montreal, so we would go to Montreal a lot. And there I was told that I should only have Jewish friends, even though we grew up in Catholic neighborhoods of Italian and Irish Roman Catholics. So I learned a lot about the Troubles in Ireland. We'd go to Montreal, and there's a large, because it's a French-speaking province, there's a lot of Moroccan Jews there. And yet, when an uncle of mine, Uncle Settler, because he now lives in Piscat Ze'ev, when he was still in Montreal, he was dating a Moroccan Jewish woman, and then I learned about all these things my family would say about Moroccan Jews, and I said, what? I'm a kid, and I'm going, wait a minute, they're Jews. I thought we were supposed to like Jews. So this was all very confusing. And as I was growing up in the 70s, I was an anarchist. And so, of course, I wasn't a Zionist because I'm an anarchist. I don't support that state. I don't support any state. But that was a really piss-poor excuse, and it was avoidance. And I avoided that for a while until the first Intifada. And I also, because I was living in Washington, D.C., which was a majority black city. Now it's kind of dipped below, but that's a whole other story we can talk about outside of here. So there I felt challenged. One, I thought I was an anti-racist because I challenged my father, who was blatantly racist. And then living in Washington, D.C. and managing to keep my white eyes open, I learned otherwise. So I had quite a few kicks in the head. And then I was challenged by friends. I was working in the anti-intervention movement in the United States against U.S. involvement in Nicaragua, Honduras, and El Salvador and Guatemala, which was active at the time during the 80s. So in 1987, some Maoist comrades would challenge me about what was going on in Israel, so I started to get involved somewhat. And I was living in Montreal a number of years later in the early 90s, and there was a conference about Palestine, and a friend got me into the conference, and I grabbed some literature from B'Tselem, and they had some sketches that were made, and I'm an artist, and I made them into prints because they were sketches of what was done to young Palestinian boys who were prisoners, with their hands behind their back, shackled, and then having them shackled to their feet over a chair. So this made a big impression on me, having worked on political prisoner issues in the United States. So I started to challenge myself and to read more about Zionism. We tried to start a group in Montreal where it was a very conservative Jewish community, in the Ashkenazi community, but also in the Sephardic Jewish community. I'm happy to say now that there are some active groups in Montreal. I moved to Toronto, and in 2000, I was active against what was going on provincially in Ontario at the time with cuts to the neoliberal cuts to social services and all, when Ariel Sharon went to Haram al-Sharif, and I was starting to lose it, and a friend emailed me and said, you need to get involved with this group. I have only 3 minutes, so I'm going to get around to some of the work we do. So there's a plethora of Jewish groups in Toronto that work around this issue, and I appear to be a member of all of them. So one of the main things I see as my work is, a lot of people in these Jewish groups want to work with the Jewish community. I figure we are a Jewish community and we need to work with each other. So I feel that my work is at least twofold, maybe threefold, because the third point is to get sleep. But it's to challenge Jews within this movement to work outside of the insularity that we reproduce over and over and over again. And also to network. To network not just with Palestinian comrades, but with the other issues going on. Some of us are doing a lot of work now to network with environmental justice and First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples around the tar sands, around Line 9 where that oil is going to come through, and talk about the similarities between northern indigenous communities that have no access to potable water and how that links up through the JNF, Stop the JNF campaign, which I also work with other folks in Canada, and how that links up with what's going on in Palestine. And beyond that, there's also the issue of depopulation. I was talking with Suzanne earlier about what I heard about in India, for instance, in the state of Chhattisgarh. There's been depopulation of over 500 villages, and I'm thinking there's got to be a connection there. And also considering that Israel supplies India with 30% of its arms and is also training snipers there to help with Operation Green Hunt, which is to rid the Adivasi from their lands in Chhattisgarh and 4 other states. And there's Israeli involvement in Congo, all over the world. So to me, it's like, how do we network and keep and connect the issues without collapsing them into like one big thing, like peace or that sort of thing. I'll stop there.
Thank you. So we thought maybe we'd take a couple questions and have you guys respond.
Yes.
Question?
Well, it's not a question, I would like to speak, but
Let's
when you
wait to-
think, okay.
Do people have questions or a couple questions or comments, and then we'll hear from Rabab and Kali and Pierre? Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for the panelists, and I appreciate a lot the last, especially because you was talking about the networking.
Louder.
My question, in fact, to all the panelists, how is, I know very well Ijan, we collaborate, we shared panels, etc., and I still really supporting, working, etc., in Europe and in some other countries, and I think in the future we have to organize something because we go further and we went a very important step when Israel, the state of Israel, I can say it, during a very important meeting in the UN, because we invite Michael Mansfield, who shared Russell Tribunal in South Africa, and then he gave lessons to the committee, and after that the committee agreed that really what's happening in Israel really touch Article 3, which is talking about apartheid. This is a very important issue for us, especially this is confirmed when we organize also something with ICAD, International Committee Against House Demolition, ETAI, and also with Richard Falk and one parliamentarian, she's here in this session. The question is, I don't know how is your networking or your organization received by some other Jewish groups, and also no, because it's I know it's not easy, it's hard, but it's very important, you know, because as example, if I want to make an activity talking about some any issue happened in Israel about the Bedouins or whatever, when I share a panel with an Israeli like Ijan and Sara, she knows that we work together, then really the public, everybody is interested really to hear what's happening. So how is your organization received in the US, and do you have links inside Israel, and how they network with other organizations? You know, we deal with some very good organizations, so thank you.
Maybe we'll take yours and then.
Okay. In a similar line, I'm Brazilian. I work for CUT, the Trade Union Confederation that's helping organize this event. I'll be blunt. How do you deal with being called a traitor when you know you can't explain, you can't separate Zionism from being Jewish, and because a lot of times you can't explain it rationally, even though you know the difference, but people take it emotionally. A cousin, a brother, a grandmother.
We don't set out to talk to Jews about Zionism. That's not how we view our role. And so, of course, we all have had those conversations and all will continue to on a regular basis. But it's not necessarily an organizational question. So I'm not sure if it makes sense to say about how I approach it, but I don't know. I think.
That was his question.
Yeah.
I think it comes with the territory, and you just, it's different for different people. I think for Jews who want to do this work, who have come out of the insularity of living their lives within the Jewish community, it's got to be a tough one. I don't have that experience, and I don't know that Lee does either.
And my answer would be, and we'll come back to this question, but my answer would be that I look at it the same way I look at the presumption that there is a pro-Israel side and a pro-Palestinian side, and if you take one side or another, then you're taking a stance and you're a traitor to... That's not the conversation we're having. We're having a conversation about justice and the lack of justice, about dignity and the lack of dignity, etc., etc. And that's the conversation. And if someone's, so it doesn't, that's not the question for me. I'm not a traitor to them. So.
We were never with them.
Exactly.
Do you want to say?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I don't know
Please.
if I'm speaking out of turn, but I think, these questions come up, not only around questions of Zionism and anti-Zionism, whenever you
Every
are with your
struggle.
community and your family and so on, and you believe in certain convictions, and your community or your family doesn't, you decide as an individual whether you're going to engage or you're going to just stay silent whenever these conversations happen and let the silence stick. And I think it, I tend to be, I don't like silence. Okay, so I personally speak up, surprise, surprise, okay? No, but I think, and I want to actually say something about how I deal with questions around Jews with members of my Palestinian family who lives under occupation and who the only Jews they ever see are those in military jeeps who come to shoot and kill and break the bones of kids and take them to prison. My cousin spent 7 years in prison. Every single member of my family got arrested at one point or another. My aunt was denied to see her children for 5 years and she was under house arrest. There is all these, and neighbors and so on. Every single, you already always, this is what you hear all the time. So the question is, so then when people, I used to, my mother passed away last year, but I used to send friends, when they go to Palestine, I go visit my mother. She used to tell me, don't send me Jews. don't send me Americans. Specifically, don't send me Jews, don't send me Americans. My cousin's lawyer was Felicia Langer. And whenever I said to her, what about Felicia Langer? What about Saj's lawyer? No, she's not, you know. And there is this kind of discussion then. There is two issues here. One is that to the Palestinians under occupation, the only Jews they see all the time are military. Two, Israeli leaders never say the Israeli people. Sharon and company and all of them, they say the Jews. They always speak in the name of all the Jews of the world and so on. At the same time, but that's the easy way to kind of like stop there and say, okay, we're not going to say anything anymore. But I think it's really important to have these discussions because historically the Palestinian movement has been anti-Zionist, has not been against Jews. And then she said to me, your great-grandfather, whatever, there was married al-Yahudiyya, or then the Nasrawiyya, and Christian or Jewish, because there's all this stuff happens all the time. And then you remind and you bring up these issues because if we are really struggling for justice, we have to have those difficult conversations. And this goes around questions of gender, this goes around questions of sexuality, there's a lot of the things, because, maybe gender may be an easy one now, okay? But sexuality, I mean, seriously, so all of these things, I think it's really important for us to have these conversations. Class, all sorts of things, or even the Americans, that they're not with their government and so on. But I think the question of the Jews is the hardest one, okay, at least for Palestinians. And I think we have to have them, because if we are thinking of a future where all of us, and I'm not talking just about Jews and Palestinians, all of us live together and we are going to have justice, we have to have them. I mean, we really do. So then you go out of this whole question of traitor to your community and you think, who's your community?
Yeah.
Exactly.
I mean, just one organizational response. So the place it comes up organizationally, I mean, obviously we directly challenge reactionary Zionist organizations. We have campaigns, we do direct action, we respond when we're asked to by our, fellow activists. But with liberal Zionist and Jewish peace groups that are not anti-Zionist, we don't struggle with them. We're not trying to move them, we're not trying to infiltrate their organizations. They're doing what they're doing, and through our activity, sometimes that pushes them and sometimes they come over or whatever. We don't do that activity, but there's often a lot of antagonism towards us from them. And so sometimes we have to deal with that. Yeah. Did you want to respond?
That's meant also as a response to your question. Yeah.
I think the co-coordination and collaboration we can talk more about. Our work in Israel has mostly been with individual Mizrahi Jews.
Because how we can change the society if we don't work with the people inside?
That's not a lot of our. We don't see ourselves as trying to change Israeli society.
Okay.
That change we think will come from the Palestinian struggle. So, and the other movements in the region. So, I just want to say something about time. We started a little late, and so we have the room till 6:30. We'll probably end around 6:20. And of course, people leave when you need to, but we'll keep talking. It's good. Our priority is hearing from Rabab and Kali, and then we'll.
Okay, all right. So I first want to say that it's really a pleasure to be here. And I'm saying this both to my comrades, my sisters and brothers here, as well as to people in the room, because it's really been a labor of love to work together. We fight. Labor of love means also we fight. We disagree. We have different perspectives, but it's actually really working on this delegation, coming together and arguing and agreeing and so on. And I think I'm seeing it, and we will debrief when we go back to the US, but I think it's been really amazing, and we're actually putting on like really good workshops and so on. I don't want to like self-congratulate, but I think it's really, really good. Okay. I also like the what IJAN does because of how you see your role and so on. I do have some questions. I'm going to ask some questions. But I think one of the things, let me flag the things that I thought were really, like for me, were really good. I really like your sort of implicit critique, and I would like to out it more, the critique of post-Zionism.
Yeah.
People who claim that we're now in a post-Zionist era, kind of like Zionism has finished and so on. So I really like that. There's a whole group of post-Zionist Israeli historians, kind of like, we're finished with Zionism. Now we can actually enter the post-Zionism because it is if you have a Zionist-centric analysis, yes, you can say you're finished with Zionism. But if you actually have a justice-centered analysis, you're not finished. So I think that actually I really like that a lot. I think the whole question of almost every one of you said that you have been part of sort of like radical politics around questions of justice, but then you weren't talking about the whole question. And then something happens accidentally with you. So I'm wondering, how could this accidental trend become a strategy? Not accidental, because we can't keep bumping into people and say to them, hey, what's wrong with you? Why aren't you, and so I think we need to kind of like think about how do we do that. So I'm kind of like thinking there is a tension between the whole question of kind of like thinking about an anti-Zionist Jewish network and the question of kind of staying away from identity politics.
Yeah.
So there is this kind of like, I think it's really important to strategically be very clear about the fact that you do have a privilege being Jewish, so you really need to, and you have a responsibility to use that, all right? At the same time, kind of like, how do you get out of the whole, and like not always get yourselves locked into it, because sometimes it's also really difficult to kind of like always be having baggage, and it's not about just Jewish, about any kind of, identity thing. You get pegged into a certain thing. So that's a big question for me. Okay, so what do we do about that? Okay, the other question, I have another question in general. Like, okay, don't have them in order, so I'm going to shift back and forth. Structurally, maybe bigger, like just in terms of IJAN and strategy, the whole question of settler colonialism. And settler colonialism, we were talking about it earlier in the earlier workshop, not here, but I think it's really good to have the conversation between the two. And so, kind of like, if we're going to think about, there's several issues. One of the whole exceptionalism of the US and the Israel. And I think we really need to kind of highlight that and it's all settler colonial societies, including Brazil. And like, so yesterday I mentioned something at the academic boycott panel, and there was a young Brazilian student who wasn't really happy with me saying it's a settler colonial. He said, it is a settler colonial, I'm sorry, settler colonialism, wipe out the indigenous population and build states and assume nobody has ever existed, or they just exist in the past. They don't exist today. So I think this is kind of like something to think about. What does this mean, and how do we think about it? Also, where are the limits of comparisons, and where are the potentialities for comparison? So historically, and especially when we talk about, for instance, Sephardic Jews or Mizrahi Jews from Arab and Muslim third world countries and so on, there is this whole assumption that, and especially with the Black Panthers. So then there is a comparison between the Sephardic Mizrahi community and the African American community in the United States. And there is huge differences. Yeah. And the reason I'm saying that, because the implications for Palestinian work in the US then becomes to think about kind of like, this is a different situation with indigenous people in the United States and the African American, because there is a whole different of kidnapping, enslavement, and so on. And I know of the bombing of the synagogues in Baghdad, and the magic carpet, all of them, Alibaba. It's very interesting, Orientalist names too for all these operations. Before even Edward Said, wrote the book. But I think it's really important to kind of think about what are things, do things fit, but not only do they fit carefully, but how do we think about what do they mean for our work? What do they mean for our alliances and so on? And where do things kind of come in and don't come in? My other question is the whole anti-Semitism. Okay, so I think I've raised this before, and I want to raise it again, because we're still having this conversation. That I argue, and you've heard me before, that anti-Semitism is a context-specific phenomenon that has occurred. I argue has occurred in a particular time in Europe and led to disastrous. Should we today continue calling anti-Jewishness anti-Semitic, or say it's anti-Jewish hatred? Because it's very different. The minute you say anti-Semitic, it invokes the image of the Holocaust, the image of the concentration camps, and is kind of like the stuff that's happening today, which is hate speech. It's not that not hate speech, but is it the same, or is it heritage from that? Okay. The question of I really like the whole you're refusing to kind of think about dialogue. and think about joint struggle and perspective of justice as being the perspective that we would work on, and the whole question of thinking about peace, that there is no peace without justice. So, like some people just want to have peace because they want to reinforce the status quo, but some people are really working towards justice, whether it is a status quo or not status quo. It's not status quo. Without justice, it's not a good status quo. So even if you have peace there, it's not a good thing. We don't want it, But I think that's really great. Okay, so the question is, you don't work with Jews in Israel. So what should the Jews do? No. Okay. Because there is a huge discussion, and Helen Thomas, when she made that statement at the White House, she got kicked out of her because somebody asked her, what should the Jews do? She said they should go back. They should go back from they came from. Of course, not everybody came. I mean, maybe their grandparents or whatever, and there were Palestinian Jews, and so on. But this is the question. If you're talking about, and yes, I realize that geographically there is a lot of space. If you want to talk about the logistics, there is a lot of space for the Palestinian refugees to return. If the idea of Jews specifically to de-Zionize Israel, okay, I'm not sure about the D business. I don't like it a lot. I like the anti better. But if that is, so what? There are people who are living in other people's homes and they're living there, they're using their orchard, they're doing all of this stuff. And the sky did not fall when the settlers were moved from Gaza. So, I'm kind of like thinking, and I don't know, my idea is that I think Jews should be part of the Palestinian organizations, and it should be sort of similar to the ANC model, particular one person, one vote. But the ANC, Joe Slovo was the head of the Communist Party and also the head of the armed wing of the ANC. Very different than what we have. And the most farthest thing that has happened was the question of Matzbin. Or that young girl who was like in Jenin with, what's his name, is Bedi.
Tali Fahima.
Yeah. But that's, and that was presented differently in the media and the whole sexual prowess of the terrorists and all of this kind of crazy stuff. But what kind of what can we think about to reverse the trend? How do we reverse the trend of immigration to Israel? Not only what should we do with those there? What do we do with reversing the trend? Then finally is the question of race. Race with an IJAN. Race. Majority of IJAN, yes, you do have members and you have linkages with Jews who come from third world countries, from communities of color, Jews of color. But that's a very small number, okay? And I think I understand because you're from the US, of course, okay? But how do we think about the whole question of race? And this also is linked up to the whole question of identity politics and being Jewish and not being Jewish and so on. Because, there isn't a Jewish conspiracy, it's not a conspiracy, but there are too many influential right-wing Jews who are speaking up, and not as many voices. We refer to Elmer Berger, who passed away maybe 20, 30 years ago.
Yeah.
And we talk about, maybe the Judith Butlers of the world and so on and all of you guys, but how do we think about that? How do we approach a subject without always being scared of being labeled an anti-Semite, and you have to do so much homage before you get to it? How do you grow? How do you grow as IJAN?
Okay. So a couple comments from Colin. And then Pierre, it might be good for you also to be just part of these discussions.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Well, I'm honestly sitting here thinking what would be the best way to contribute to the conversation, because it's a little bit different than the little prepared notes and stuff I had for myself based upon, I think, particularly some of the questions. And just also trying to be mindful of the context. I think your question, quite honestly, kind of threw me a little bit. Is making me think, not in a bad way, not in a negative way, but it just brought me back to, I think, a lot of my response was very U.S.-centric. So it's making me think of a number of different things about, well, how do you approach that question in a different way, with an understanding that as it relates to African people in total, right? There is a much more problematic and interconnected history that we touched on, those of you who were in our last panel that was in this room, about the settler colonial narrative, and particularly the kind of triadic relationship, if you want to call it that, between the United States, South Africa, and Israel. and the interconnected histories between those two and between the liberation struggles. And for those of you who may not know what I'm referring to, I'll just maybe give a little bit of history there. The South African struggle and the Black liberation struggle have been very interconnected for a long, long time, going back to when the ANC was founded in the early 1920s, in fact. There were several black folks from the United States who actually were at their founding Congress and were actually part of those discussions and conversations around the framing. It's often not so much referred to anymore, but it's a historical fact. There were always kind of relationships primarily through different Pan-African Congresses, different connections through different Pan-African movements prior to World War II. But most particularly, there was a lot of connections through two different organizations, through the Communist Party and through the World Council of Churches, or different affiliated groups of churches that before World War II, that's how a lot of black Pan-Africanists actually operated and were able to move and found the resources to move and travel through the Caribbean, travel to the continent, travel to London or travel to Paris, where these were kind of the places of the intersections where folks from the continent, folks from the Caribbean, folks from the United States would come together and meet. Now, where it becomes somewhat complicated is that there's a period of history in the 1930s and 40s where there began to be the Communist Party really introduced into some aspects of the Black liberation movement this whole notion of the Jewish question and how we should relate to it, being black people within the United States. And it was very much also linked into a lot of the same discussions in the international panels around how we should relate to South Africa and the South African question, right? Often debated within the Common Term and the Common Forum and within the same panels, within the same kind of bodies with the same folks deliberating on the same questions. Now, where it becomes, I think, concrete is that through a kind of well, let me take a step back. Within the United States, a large portion of the Communist Party and the left, as we understand it, communist, anarchist, socialist, was very heavily in the early 20th century. It was defined by what we would now call white ethnics, particularly folks from Eastern Europe. And Jews played a very central role in that. And a very positive role in the earlier parts of the history, and brought a lot of the unresolved questions from Europe, brought them to the United States to be kind of hashed out, debated, struggled through, kind of formulated, used as, we can understand what's happening in the United States by analogy what's happening in Russia, by analogy, which often, quite frankly, didn't fit, but that was what people brought with them as part of forming the relationships, right, and forming the analysis. Through a large part, through some of those relationships, I think that really kind of, the Communist Party USA doesn't get credit for, but part of what became known as the Black Jewish Alliance from the 1920s to the 1960s was really formalized within kind of these progressive and left spaces, which wound up playing a very critical role in a part of what most people know as the civil rights struggle of the 1950s and 60s, right? And the different levels of support and folks actually not only committing resources, but putting their lives on the line to come down to Alabama, come down to Mississippi, come down to Louisiana, and put in not just a week or two, but in some cases people are actually moving down there and putting their lives on the line, being called white traitors, being called, then people find that they were Jewish and not just white. You add another layer of hatred on top of that that was embedded in the South. In the U.S., this whole notion of being very much of kind of historically a very anti-Semitic place, right? Which is somewhat kind of been erased the last 40 years, but that's another conversation. But it becomes complicated in the 1960s around two questions: this kind of triadic relationship. Prior to 1967, most of your kind of established black leaders, I wouldn't call them necessarily Zionists, I don't think they quite understood what that meant. They didn't really quite understood, in most cases, didn't quite understand what the actual settler project of Israel with the state. They didn't really know what it was. They had some inference on the relating to, we've had some positive relationship. These are the only white folks, let me put it quite brief. These Jewish folks that hang around us and who we know from these relationships, these are the only white folks that seem to be earnest about dealing with our issues and addressing racism. So then it came somewhat as a shock as people began to understand what happened in '67 in the war. And then some of the more particularly younger radical folks like within SNCC started to took a step out and took a very bold line was saying, you know, we stand with those who are oppressed, not with those who are doing the oppression. And in this case, from what we know and what we understand, the Israelis are allied with the United States, fighting against, you know, brown people, and from what we can clearly see, you know, they are the oppressors, not the oppressed. So it flipped the narrative. And most of the folks who were, again, from the radical trend of the Black Liberation Movement got it automatically. I see, you know, this is my first real exposure to this issue in a concrete way. And from my own direct experience, I see and understand exactly what's going on, and I know what that is. So I'm siding with the Palestinians. I'm siding with these folks, which wasn't initially a piece of I reject, you know, I'm taking an anti-Semitic position or anything like that. It had nothing to do with that. But there were some consequences that came about as a result of that relationship. Basically, within 2 years, SNCC was gone from it taking that position and position relative to that around Vietnam. Because its northern white, predominantly Jewish kind of funding networks were dried up very quickly, overtaking this particular piece. And so our history from that point forward, the relationship between so-called the alliance between blacks and Jews, that was one of the fundamental issues that broke it. Other people would tell you affirmative action and some of the other stuff, partially true, but that's not the real deal. The real deal wound up, I think, having to be after '67, and after the laws had changed in the American apartheid formally got defeated, at least on paper, in the early 1960s, 64 and 65. And so you wind up having a particular growing and emerging block of folks who, black politicians, at least for a while, had to be somewhat accountable to their bases. And their bases at that time were very radical and very concerned about issues of justice, and were holding them accountable to it. So as the CBC, the Congressional Black Caucus, develops, the Zionists quickly identified, we now have a developing and emerging bloc within the U.S. Congress which is diametrically opposed to our interests. And we have to do everything we can to fight that emerging body from being able to exercise any influence over U.S. foreign policy that would challenge our interests. Hence the South Africa question, how we come back to that. A lot of us didn't quite understand until really, I think, the mid-'70s, the relationship between Zionism and the apartheid regime in South Africa. We were just really beginning to, learn, I think in that time, or relearn, that generation was relearning international economics and political economy in a different form and fashion. But we run smack dab into conflicting with the Zionist bloc and the Zionist forces within the United States, both in challenging apartheid with the growing kind of anti-apartheid movement, but also challenging the ongoing colonization and the occupation at this point of Palestine. And you see that reflected in some of the comments in the Jimmy Carter regime around Andrew Young taking an encouraging step of recognizing the Palestinians and losing his job immediately after that, right? To the point that there's no black person that either the Democratic Party or the Republican Party would nominate to a position like that again until basically Colin Powell did it in the late in 2000. So you're talking about a 20-year stretch. Not that Reagan or some of those folks would have did some of that anyway, but I bring it up by point of analogy because sometimes people have this illusion that the Democrats promote more black people than the Republicans do, and quite factually that's not true. It's about the same. But the Republicans have been very keen since Nixon of actually putting black people in a little higher places than the Democrats do. Right, that's been their common practice for quite some time. If you really go back and look at it, and it's based upon the notion that which Richard Nixon again gets some credit for. It was Richard Nixon who really came up with this whole notion of affirmative action in the 1950s. Many people want to give Democrats credit for that. That really wasn't their policy. It was Richard Nixon who came up with this whole notion around black capitalism and the first promotion of affirmative action policies during his regime. So there's a very complex history that we have with this whole neo-colonial piece that I think we need to interrogate further. But I think the critical thing, bringing it up to the present, that I think relates is that as far as understanding this history, understanding this ongoing relationship, one of the things that we've always been pushing from the Black liberation movement, particularly the last, I would say, 50, 60 years, is that we need more white people organizing white people in the United States. And that's something the white people in the United States typically are not that good at. And so you always wind up being in these kind of weird solidarity type relationships. So, Nicaragua's having some issues, we'll join up with that. Cuba's doing something, we'll ride with that. Venezuelans are now doing something, we'll get involved with that. There's some issues around at the border, we'll get involved with that. But dealing with the reactionary forces that are deep in the quote-unquote heartland, from the white supremacist forces who are deep off in Michigan or deep off in Alabama, to dealing with the growing reactionary politics within, that's reflected within the Republican Party. That's only a sliver of it. How do we deal with that and how do we address that? And then when you put, within the U.S. context, white Jews in the middle of that mix, with the Zionist piece, it becomes a very particular thing that we have to address and have to figure out in a strategic manner. But I think the critical piece around some of the work in terms of responding to what I heard around that I think IJAN has been doing, which kind of breaks a new mold of why we've been, we in the sense of MXG being allied with it, is its clarity about what its role is, which we haven't had from a good number of the Jewish organizations that have existed in the past that have also tried to develop a certain type of different variations of anti-Zionist politics, which often more or less really kind of boiled down to a liberal Zionist politics when it came out in concrete practice, as we kind of observed this over the years. So being able to have a clear break, I think with that is refreshing. But I have to agree with Rabab, and I know it's not for lack of trying, but there really is the question of how does this become more than just an accidental phenomenon? I think there's, and how do we generalize it so that there's more forces within the U.S., but there's also other forces, other Jewish forces internationally who are coming to some of the same conclusions. How do they find each other, organize, and become a stronger force?
So we're pretty much out of time. I want to give Pierre you just a couple minutes to bring some points, and then we can talk to people one-on-one who want to stay. Yeah, and we have a very big discussion tomorrow that'll be more about the interconnections that Sue was talking about in how we all organize against Zionism.
Well, excuse me for my English. I am one of the chairman of the UJFP, French Jewish Union for Peace. We are about 300, 400 members. We are non-Zionist, a big majority of us anti-Zionist. A part of us are in IJAN. We have relations with many Palestinian groups, and we went many times in Palestine. Last time, for example, it was a mission, Arabic, Jewish and Arabs together in Palestine in 210. And we have relations with the anti-colonialist Israelis, for example, of course, Alternative International Center, but not only. And what can I say just about Zionism? Some things more. I think it's deeply a racist theory. It's the theory that of separation, of isolation. saying that Jews and non-Jews cannot live together. It's a theory that thinks that the Palestinians will become like Indians of Northern America, of Aborigines of Australia, unable to claim their rights. There is no difference between left and right inside the Zionism. The right said we want the transfer, and the left made the same. For example, in Der Yassin, there was first Irgun, and then the Haganah came, so there's no difference. Now I shall say there are 2 points important in this discussion. The first of all, why the G in IJAN or in UGFP? Because if we have in the movement of solidarity for Palestine, is it necessary to be in the Jewish movement? I think yes, for many reasons. One of the reasons is that this war is not a religious war, it's not a war of one community against another, it's not a nationalist war, it's a war against colonialism, against racism, it's a war for equality of rights. So it is very important that Jews claim that we are in this fight as Jews in name of our past. I didn't speak about my past, but my whole family disappeared during the World War. So the fact that the Zionists use this past for their crimes is a second way of killing another time. And as Jews also, we can say one of the reasons of this war is that the leaders of Israel are never judged for their crimes and have the complete support of all Western governments. We know that the Western governments support Israel because it's militarist, because it's imperialist, because it's a part of Western countries inside the Middle East. But the opinion support less and less. But sometimes they support Israel because they think we like Jews and we want to help them. First of all, I think that to create the new Israeli man, they killed the Jew. The Jewish past, the Jewish history, and the Israeli history are completely different. No, completely different. The militarism, for example, in the Jewish history doesn't exist. Racism doesn't exist. So, but we have to say that Zionism is a crime against Palestine and is a suicide for the Jews. It is impossible to think that many years this kind of crime will continue. It's impossible. We have to say that. We have to say, you love the Jews. If you love somebody, don't tell him to commit suicide. We have to tell him. You asked a question about what kind of end to this war. In UGFP, non-Zionist or anti-Zionist, we think that the Jewish state has to disappear. It's the center. The fact of a Jewish state is racism. And in France, if you know the French history, the only time there was a French state, it was Vichy during the World War. The only time. So, of course, a state has to be a state of all its citizens with complete equality. So, will the Jewish Israelis stay or leave? The fact is, they can stay with one reason, one condition. Complete equality of rights, economical, political, everything. If not, if they don't accept, they leave. For the settlers, it's exactly the same. But for my opinion, the settlers in the West Bank are fascist, but it's something else. And they have, of course, to leave. Well, what kind of conclusion I can say? we have a special work to make about one aspect of Zionism. They wrote a new story, a story which is lie, lie and lie. I was Zionist when I was 16 years old. I know all the lies, the earth without people, for you know the rest. So we have to explain. Of course, we won't be heard, but the Jews will know that some of them, a minority, are claiming the history is not that one. There was not exile, there was not return. All is the leaders of Zionism used the Bible as a book of colonial conquest.
Yeah.
We have to say that every time.
Yeah.
We will be heard a little. We can be heard.
Thank you, Pierre. So we are very much over time. Thank you for staying. And again, we have a bigger discussion that'll include more of us tomorrow. And we'll also stay a little bit if people have questions and there's materials. But I just, in closing, wanted to quickly respond to this question of Jews of color. And unfortunately, David couldn't make it. So some of the parts of the network that that are not white or European aren't here. But also in the United States, it's tricky. It's very hard for Jews of color to be part of mostly a white organization. And the way that, there's a very big population of European Jews in the United States. And so we do have Jews of color in the organization, but what our organization, we didn't talk about it, but this is also a political community. We're also a political community, and there's a certain political home. And, if some of the black Jews who have worked with us are looking for a political home, we can't be a substitute for a black organization. So the Jews of color who have the easiest time working in IJAN also have other political homes that support other parts of their location or their organizing. And also, we didn't talk about our structure, but we also would encourage autonomous organizing. Like we have IJAN Labor, and labor activists do that, or Jews of color in IJAN at different points have formed sort of an autonomous team within IJAN. We don't need to do that around queer members in the U.S., but because a lot of the network is queer, or Canada. But it's it's an ongoing struggle, and we're always, it's not like we've arrived somewhere. We're always unlearning Zionism, and we're always unlearning racism, and that's going to be hard for people of color to be in a white organization in that way, and so we're still sort of figuring that out. And I think it's important, and then just the last thing about it not being accidental is we're also figuring that out. Like we have study groups, we've done assemblies, we've done organizing institutes, and a lot of our membership in the United States is younger than, certainly younger than we are. And then in Europe, a lot of our membership, like we have membership that is 22, and we have membership that's 83. So it's a big spectrum, and there's a lot of intergenerational work, but I think those are really good questions, and we'll certainly take them back and figure them out. So thank you so much.